bring some ponderings this morning. I'm going to say just a tiny bit about hate, what it is, and to ask whether we're in hateful times. And there's many flavours of hate, but I'm going to speak predominantly around anti-racism, racist hate, and speak from the context of Britain, and be aware of that when I bring you my ponderings. I'm sharing from within a particular context. I'm also going to say a little bit about resisting and transforming hate within ourselves, between ourselves, and from above. And I'll share some examples of diverse and imaginative faith and civil society responses to hate, which will include a little bit about Bradford, but I could talk about Bradford, which is a city and a district in the north of England. I could talk about that for hours. So I'm just going to give you a tiny flavour of some of the things that we did in Bradford. And I think it's important to share the lenses with which I'm bringing my peace ponderings to you. So my own peace thinking and practice has been hugely influenced by the Quaker Adam Curl, who was a Quaker and international mediator. He was also a gardener and a poet, and he was the first chair of peace studies at Bradford, where I worked for many years. And he spoke about peacemaking as having two elements. So the peacemaker has two tasks. The first is how you transform unpeaceful relations to peaceful ones, and how the second task is how we work to transform the conditions so that they are unfavourable to violence and favourable to peace. And I think, although that seems a very simple idea, this notion of relations and conditions, for me, it's absolutely crucial that we work at both. And I'm also really influenced by Lederach, John Paul Lederach, the US Mennonite peacemaker, mediator, scholar, who in turn was friends with and influenced by Adam Curl. And you'll all be familiar with Lederach's bringing together of peace and justice. And for me, justice and peace are indivisible. So peace is more than the absence of violence and war, it's the presence of justice. In terms of hate, hate is a complex and simple word. It means many things, it has many flavours. At its simplest level, it's an intense dislike. In the UK, there are different definitions actually of hate crime between Northern Ireland, England, Wales and Scotland. But it's things like hate crime is a way to describe criminal behaviour that's motivated by hostility or demonstrating hostility towards someone's disability, race, religion, sexual orientation or transgender identity. So that notion of hostility and hatred towards somebody because of who they are or who they're perceived to be. And hate speech is described here in Britain as inciting violence or hatred or discrimination against other persons or groups. So for me, there's something really important about hate in terms of violence, inciting violence and dehumanisation. And when words are complex, I often turn to the poets. So I am going to turn to George, the poet. I also wanted to say something about extreme hate. So that notion of fascist politics being about identifying enemies, of appealing to the in-group, smashing truth, replacing it with power. Because there's been a climate in the UK where that identifying of enemies, some of those flavours and trends have been worrying me in the last few years. And I think it's always worth being reminded that fascism doesn't arrive in fancy dress. And in the UK, we need to remember this, that fascism arrives as your friend to restore your honour. This poem that many of you will be familiar with from Michael Rosen, to remind you of how great you think you once were, perhaps I would say. So that notion of how things can how trends can start to appear, and at what level we need to look for the signs to be worried about those trends. So are we in the UK? Are we in hateful times? In Europe, are we in hateful times? So this is some analysis from the Fundamental Rights Director, an EU agency, who in 2018 argued that there's compelling evidence of unacceptable patterns of extreme hatred and vilification, particularly towards migrants and even more particularly towards Muslim groups. So that's some analysis there. We certainly saw a spike, as John mentioned at the beginning, around the time of Brexit in hate crime in the UK. And there's a state of hate report that people who are interested in the UK can look at, from Hope Not Hate, that speak of political discontent being exploited by the far right. Divisions, they feel, their analysis would say that they think divisions are likely to increase. This is pre-COVID, and there is, or around just at the start of COVID. And there's also some good news. So we've seen a flourishing of very beautiful mutual aid and community connections because of COVID, and a sense of community spirit in some areas. And there's a report called More in Common that speaks of that even more. So that there is some good news always. But a crucial thing for me in the State of Hate report is that in the UK, far-right messaging and language is now in the mainstream. So some of the ways of speaking about people and groups of people that previously would have been in the realm of the traditional far-right organisations like the British National Party, who are in decline, they might be in decline, but at the same time, the sort of rhetoric, the sort of narratives they speak about is now in the mainstream. And one example of that is this for me, horrendous poster that Nigel Farage produced, the Breaking Point poster, that even somebody like George Osborne, the Conservative Chancellor, former Chancellor, described as having as being reminiscent of the 1930s. So a very particular narrative that Nigel Farage is presenting there, and there were people that tried to raise this as inciting violence through the courts. And of course, we have the British tabloid press. So just a flavour of some of the headlines in the British tabloid press. So very much anti-migrant, quite hateful narratives, absolutely there on the shelves, a newsagents near you. I'm thinking about hate. For me, it's easy, isn't it, to just think of, oh, that's the bad people and I'm one of the good people. But of course, I have capacity to hate. I have capacity to hurt. I have capacity to harm. So when I'm thinking about hate, I need to think about myself and my own capacity for that. And I think Lederach's quote here is useful in terms of some of the things we need to watch out for when we assume superiority, when we oppress, when we refuse to listen, when we discount and exclude others, when we hate, when we project blame with no self-reflection. And for me, as somebody who is white, I need to think an awful lot about my capacity to oppress and my own privilege. And there's a quote here from the Race and Privilege report that was written by the Quaker Council for European Affairs, QCEA, which calls of a challenge to us all, and the challenge may feel overwhelming, but we all have opportunities to unlearn behaviours and assumptions. And this notion of discovering just ways of seeking racial justice as a spiritual practice, I think, is an interesting idea. But of course, if we just think about ourselves, that's not enough either, because as Angela Davis says here, that racism, hatred, and I think this goes for other forms of hatred, is embedded in structures and institutions. So we need to think about how we tackle hate from above as well. And for me, a crucial element in tackling hate from above is thinking about solidarity, but meaningful solidarity, not kind of saviourship, but solidarity that doesn't assume that our struggles are the same struggles, as Sarah Ahmed says here, that doesn't make assumptions that our pain is the same. And as Andia said at the beginning, solidarity involves commitment, it involves work. So we do live on common ground, but our experiences are diverse. And in the UK, we can, and there'll be all sorts of examples in other places, but we can make connections. There's a whole load of organisations, some of them are Black-led organisations, migrant-led organisations, but organisations who are doing thinking about how to challenge hate from above and also from within and between. And we can make connections of solidarity in our neighbourhoods and local areas. And I'll put all of the links in the chat when I'm done, so don't worry about making a note. I'll do that in the group chat. I'm going to speak a little bit more about tackling hate between, so that idea of how we can work at hate between ourselves. And a quote that will be so familiar to all of you, I'm sure. But how do we interrupt injustice? How do we interrupt hate without mirroring injustice or mirroring hate? And for me, I found one of the most useful ways of thinking about hate from Barbara Deming, The Two Hands of Nonviolence. So the full quote, and again, I'll put that in the group chat, talks of how with one hand we say to someone who is angry, to an oppressor or to an unjust system, we say, stop what you're doing, stop, enough. But then also we have another hand that can say, I won't let you go, I won't cast you out of the human race. And I think a thing that really interests me when I think about hate, organised hate, is which hand I use. Do I use one hand more than the other? Are there times when one hand is needed more than the other? Can I do both at the same time? And maybe just take a moment within yourself to think, which of those two hands are dominant? Are you somebody who is more likely to be the stop what you're doing, enough, in terms of hate? Are you somebody that's more reaching out and connecting? Which hand for you is dominant? I wanted to share some faith responses to hate on the streets. So they've dwindled over the last few years, but for many years in Britain we had a far right social movement that was extremely anti-Muslim called the English Defence League, and I want to share a little bit about some responses to the English Defence League, because I think they represent different elements of the two hands of non-violence and how maybe to respond to a very particular flavour of hate on the streets. So many of you from the UK will know the story of York Mosque. So in 2013, the English Defence League went to a mosque to have an angry protest, and the imam and the worshippers at the mosque in York, in the north of England, instead of maybe responding in an angry way, said, come in, have a cup of tea, have a biscuit, let's talk. Maybe our concerns are the same concerns. And the imam of the mosque described this as a very beautiful, beautiful thing, this way of connecting and reaching out. And it's obviously not going to be always a safe thing to do. It's not always going to be an appropriate thing to do. This was an incredibly compassionate and courageous response to hate. But I think it's worth noticing when sometimes people are able to do that, reaching out. But it is something that needs some careful thought, whether that's possible, whether that's safe, and it won't always be, but to acknowledge when it does happen. something that I know much more about and could speak about forever is a very beautiful example from Bradford Women for Peace. So before the English Defence League were holding protests with a few thousand people in Bradford, Bradford Women for Peace, a very diverse network of Christians and Muslims, there were former Greenham Common women, just all ages, came together with a message of peace and unity. And the women decided to stand alongside each other and create a web, a giant web of green ribbons to show and to symbolise that the lives of women in Bradford are woven together. And it was also something to set the tone before a really angry and hateful protest, to say what we care about is each other, and what we care about is Bradford, and what we're for peace. So they purposefully decided not to say that they were against the EDL, that the green ribbons didn't symbolise what Bradford Women for Peace were against. Rather, they symbolised what Bradford Women for Peace stood for. And also the ribbons, as well as kind of creating a giant web and a space for peace, were decorated on loads of buildings, loads of civic buildings in Bradford. People wore the green ribbons in their hair and their hijabs. Taxi drivers put them on their cars, and so it became this symbol of we're not going to allow angry hate to destroy us, to destroy our city. And there's a particular reason that people felt so strongly that this was needed, because Bradford in 2001 had seen the worst rioting on the mainland for around 20 years. So there's a complex history to Bradford. And the first gathering of Bradford Women for Peace happened in 2010, when there was a big EDL protest coming to Bradford, but has carried on whenever needed. So that notion of people, of women coming together and to say what they're for, really did set the tone. And if you were to ask lots of people in Bradford, they'd know what the green ribbon stands for. When I share all of the links in the group chat, I'll also include a film where you can watch the women come together and to sing, and you can hear more of the story. So I'll share that with you too. And this is quite a different approach to the English Defence League. This is more of a hand up saying, stop what you're doing. But I think there's a reaching out element as well. And English Disco Lovers was set up by Chris Alton. So this was his idea. He's a Quaker, a young Quaker, and he decided to combat hate with disco. And one of the things that he was doing is he was Google bombing the acronym. So you can see English Disco Lovers is the same set of initials as English Defence League. So when people were searching for EDL, instead of lots of anti-Muslim, insulting, abusive, horrible, hateful stuff, disco came up. Loads of disco music and disco dancing appeared. And also people would gather at EDL protests, a very courageous thing to do. EDL protests have often been violent, but people would gather, and when the angry shouting people appear, people would respond with the spectacle of disco. And I think it's a really interesting notion, and there's a real kind of creativity in this sort of resistance, and there's loads of other resistance, creative, imaginative resistance to hate that you can see from elsewhere in the world. So this is just one small example. And I think there is an element of reaching out. There's an element of dialogue in the spectacle, and a clear message often was don't hate, gyrate. Another example of the way I've seen civil society and faith organisations respond to hate is to create community mediation networks. At time of EDL protest, one of the things that can be really helpful is to not rely on a security policing response, but to have people have a presence on the street to do peace observing, to do mediation. So there's a different, again, a different tone to what can be very angry and potentially very violent spaces. And on the left, or on my left, there's Luton, which is that St Mary's Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. And I think Peter Adams is going to be part of the day. And they've done really incredible work. So Luton is where the English Defence League come from. They were founded, and the founding members are there in Luton. And St Mary's Centre for Peace and Reconciliation developed really kind of embedded community network responses to EDL protest, including having clergy be observers within EDL protests. So very much reaching out, but also being very clear about what wouldn't be acceptable in terms of hate and abuse and violence in Luton. And in Bradford, we also developed a community peace network response to English Defence League protest, partly because there's often a real antagonistic relationship, or had been a very antagonistic relationship between young Muslim men and the police. And so wanting to work with particularly incredible Muslim mediators, so that there could be a different approach to what was happening in Bradford than a purely kind of police security response. And our first base was actually at Bradford Cathedral. So we had a peace base at Bradford Cathedral, where we were able to convene and communicate and do a whole load of things around preventing rumours erupting, and be in touch with a whole load of community mediators, basically kind of peacekeepers on civil society and faith peacekeepers on the streets of Bradford. And that's a whole, I could speak about that experience for a long time. I think one of the things that both Luton and Bradford have in common is that we were doing what Lederach describes as creating that web of connections. So some of the work that we certainly had done in Bradford, some of the interfaith, the intercultural dialogue work that people often, I think, underestimate and undervalue, and describe as just a talking shop. It was some of those kind of the residential interfaith spaces where people had really built trust up between each other. We were able to kind of use those networks at the difficult times for communication, for layers of mediators and peacekeepers on the streets. And it's that notion of, if you can create a web of connections where you have a diversity of connections at all sorts of different levels in a town or in a city, then you can hold strong, just like the spider's web holds strong. You can hold strong at difficult times. I also wanted to just say something about everyday hate. So hate isn't just something that's organised, it can erupt at any moment. And this is Virginie V, who has lived in Bradford for over a decade, is originally from France, and as one of many people who had citizenship insecurities because of Brexit, had been on a Remain, a pro staying in the EU march in London with her son. And then she travelled back up from London on a train, and she was in Yorkshire, and she received a torrent of abuse in relation to the badge that she had on, a pro-EU badge, from some white men on a train. She also ended up being physically assaulted, and her son, who is of mixed heritage, her son was racially abused. causing huge trauma to both of them. And V is a good friend of mine. The men were charged and found guilty in the end. But possibly the worst thing for V was that nobody on the train came to her defence. Nobody spoke out. Nobody came and disrupted the hate in that moment. And I think it's really worth, certainly here in the UK, of maybe thinking through, if I'm on a train, if I'm on the street, what can I do? And of course, we always have to do our own mini risk assessment about what's safe and what we feel comfortable with. But maybe doing a little bit of thinking about that before, and there's some good videos online about how to disrupt hate in the moment. But doing a little bit of thinking before, how might I respond? Even just moving and sitting next to somebody can provide a buffer. There's all sorts of ways I think that we can respond. But I think just knowing from V how much it hurt that nobody spoke up for her in that moment. So for me, sometimes the hand that we need is the hand that says stop. So I care so much about the hand that reaches out, but I am both a peacemaker and an activist. Sometimes we need to have that hand that says stop, enough. So I guess one of the things I think that's so important in peace building, and I'm drawing to an end now, is that we need to use our imagination. So Lederach says here that we need to imagine something that's rooted in the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not exist. And so for all of us, maybe we can think about what can we imagine? And the last word for me, I often like to know what Bayard Rustin and others from the civil rights movement have to say. This is Bayard Rustin, a Quaker US civil rights activist, who reminds us that we don't have to achieve everything and achieve all of the good tasks. But for Bayard Rustin, what God requires is that we don't stop trying. So there's some info and links. One of the links that I'm going to share is a little toolkit that I kind of put together that's got some more ideas about how we engage with conflict and how we challenge hate. And it includes some great community dialogue tips from Tariq Bashir, who works for a project called Who is Your Neighbour, funded by Methodists in South Yorkshire. So that's a resource, and there's some more creative ideas as well about the two hands of non-violence and different examples of both resistance and resilience.